So one of the questions that I like to ponder, I come back to again and again and again over the last 30 or 40 years is try to answer for myself, what do I believe reality is? Can I distinguish between illusions, hallucinations, reality, mystical states, whatever? And so on the 3rd of December 2001, I had a dream which addressed that issue, different levels of reality and illusion and whatever. And I wrote it up afterwards. And I want to start this morning with that because it'll feed into the topic of my homily. I called it Star Spark, and it was December 3rd, 2001. A shower of yellow-red sparks exploded out of the heart of the campfire and arced parabolically across the cold autumn sky. They sizzled in the frosty air as they traced their meteoric firebows against the blue-green backdrop of the heavens. The camper who had caused the spark shower by poking dreamily at the core of the fire followed the complete trajectory of one of the sparks, and he fell into a yet deeper reverie. Or was it a vision? The spark lived 10 billion years. As its exterior cooled, a crust formed over its furnace center. Vegetation grew on its crust, luxuriant foliage of myriad forms. Then creatures evolved and cavorted about under the green canopy. More and more exotic animals emerged in long, complex food chains or in symbiotic partnerships. Some walked and some waddled. Some boated and some burrowed. Some swam and some squatted. In time, a creature arose who learned to plot the history of the spark, exhume its past, and predict its demise. This creature was actually writing a poem about the spark and the campfire supernova from which it was born on the very night that the spark ended its parabolic journey and crashed to extinction on the dewy grass. Even the fiery core of it sizzled into blackness. The camper sighed, stood up, and walked into the forest. In the cabin, at the edge of the clearing, the woman called to her husband, "The camper has abandoned the fire and walked into the forest." The husband jerked awake. He thought he had just heard his wife say to him, "The camper has abandoned the fire and walked into the forest." But his wife had been dead over 5 years. He sadly got out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom. He looked tiredly into the mirror. Nobody looked back at him. There was no image in the mirror. Then the husband realized that he was still dreaming. And he realized that he himself was only a dream. Since there was nobody looking into the mirror, and thus nothing to reflect on, the mirror dissolved and disappeared. All was quiet in the non-existent cabin at the edge of the non-existent clearing that housed the non-existent campfire, long since deserted by the non-existent camper after he had followed the arc of the non-existent spark. And they all lived unhappily, never again. So Michael Newton was a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, who specialized in using hypnotherapy as a therapeutic modality with his clients. And particularly when he was trying to get to the bottom of some pathology or a neurosis or an addiction or some kind of a fear or a phobia, he would ask the question under hypnosis, "I want you to come back to the original incident that precipitated this situation for you." And sometimes the client under hypnosis would go back to age 3 or 4. There's some childhood event that would explain, the current issue. And sometimes you find that the client would actually go back into a previous lifetime, into a past lifetime, and identify some event that was the trigger for the present issue in this present incarnation. And once that event had been identified, very often the issue in this lifetime would clear up. But on one occasion, he asked the client, he said, I want you to go back and tell me what was the incident that precipitated this particular issue in your life. And the woman started reporting a very, very strange thing, because it seemed to be love and light and compassion and joy. And she seemed to be encountering a lot of her dead relatives and iconic, spiritual figures like Jesus or the Buddha. And he realized with a start that she was reporting nothing from this present life and not something from a past incarnation, but something from the state in between the two, what Buddhism would call the bardo state. She was talking about encounters that resemble very much like the near-death experience, a light, meeting some kind of a soul pod, meeting some kind of mentor figures, being prepared for reincarnation. And so he was fascinated by this, and subsequently he made it his speciality. And over the course of the rest of his therapeutic life, he did the same thing with, tens of thousands of clients, brought them into this state, what Buddhism would call the bardo state. And so he coined the term life between lifetimes. And he wrote several books about these experiences. The first one was called Journey of Souls. The second was called Destiny of Souls. And then the third one, which he wrote specifically for therapists to teach them how to do this kind of stuff, he called Life Between Lives. And I did some training in that. I read about it a lot. But then in 2006, January 2006, I had a friend of mine who's also a clinical psychologist, a man called Matt McKay, who lives in Berkeley. He's actually the owner of a publishing business called New Harbinger Press. And I had Matt regress me in a 4-hour regression. That was one of the most important spiritual experiences of my life, where I experienced again what it's like to be in between lifetimes. And so it helped me again to try to work with this notion of what exactly is reality. And I think I've identified maybe 3 kinds of reality. There's what I would call experiential reality. Whatever you're experiencing is absolutely real, experientially. The second kind of reality would be consensual reality, what the culture believes to be true. And that may or may not accord with your particular experience. So for instance, if you're walking along the path and from the corner of your eye, you see a snake on the ground and you jump. And then you realize it's a piece of vine, just coiled vine. So was the experience of the snake real? It was real as long as it was an experience. You had an experience of seeing a snake. Was it consensually real? No. You realized afterwards it was on just a piece of vine. And so there's a consensual reality that the group believes to be the case. Now, this is also very idiosyncratic. Different cultures have totally different belief systems. So the consensual reality of people in Silicon Valley is very different from the consensual reality of the Bushmen of the Kalahari. So consensual reality moves from culture to culture. And then the third kind of reality, I believe, I would call it divine reality. This is the ultimate level of reality. So we're moving between these 3 levels constantly. Our experience of reality, the consensual reality of the culture to which we belong, and then as we go deeper and deeper into God's version of reality itself. And so what I want to ask in the homily today then is, what is the ultimate form of reality? So are we basically human beings who have occasional spiritual experiences? Or are we basically spirit beings who have occasional incarnational experiences? Which is the deeper reality? Life on planet Earth, or what's sometimes called the afterlife, or the in-between lives. So that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. And I'll make just 3 points very quickly. The first one I'm going to call life between lives. And then secondly, I'm going to say, developing your own roadmap of reality. And then thirdly, I'm just going to give you a practical exercise to assist you in that process. So firstly, life between lives. Which is life and which is between lives? So do we believe, for instance, that life is what happens on planet Earth during incarnation, and then we die, and then there's some kind of an afterlife? Or this is a cyclic process? Most of us who were raised Catholics were told to believe that, there's no pre-existence to the soul. The soul does not reincarnate from lifetime to lifetime. At the moment of conception, when a sperm meets an egg and a zygote is formed, God creates a brand new soul, infuses it into the zygote develops into an embryo that develops into a fetus that's born and becomes a child. And then when it dies, that soul is either given the thumbs up or the thumbs down. So it's going to go to hell or heaven or maybe into purgatory for a piece. So the Catholic Church traditionally, in our times at least, did not believe in reincarnation or the pre-existence of the soul. But the vast bulk of people throughout human history have believed and still do believe in some form of reincarnation where we cycle into incarnation and then we depart into a different state. So the question I'm asking myself this morning then is, which is the background and which is the foreground? I'm sure you've seen many of these kind of trick photographs or trick drawings where, depending on how you focus, you're looking at totally different objects. So, for instance, you see a picture and initially it looks like a chalice. And then you look differently and you see it's two faces facing each other, profiles facing each other. So depending on how you look at it, you infer a totally different reality. So which is the foreground and which is the background? So for instance, is the real life what we experience in the disincarnate form when we're not on planet Earth? Or is this the real life down here and the afterlife is just a kind of an interlude in the play? So is incarnation one level of the dream and disincarnation is another level, maybe a deeper level of the dream? So I'm going to play around with a few metaphors to kind of deal with this topic. Imagine a huge mountain, maybe Mount Everest, 29,029 feet high, and then a deep, 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 deep valley. Maybe, for instance, the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the lowest point on planet Earth. It goes down to 1,200 feet, below sea level. Or maybe the Mariana Trench in the Atlantic goes down 7 miles down into the ocean. So the question I'm asking myself then is, are we, as human beings, are we valley dwellers who live in the valley and occasionally ascend the mountaintop of heaven? Or are we mountaintop dwellers who occasionally descend into the valley that we call incarnation or planet Earth? So where's our home base? Is the valley our home base and we make the odd excursion into the heavens, into God? Or is the mountaintop our base camp and we make the odd descents into planet Earth? Which is which? So it feels to me like heaven is the real life and the life between lives are simply our incarnation. It's almost like a necklace. If you had a necklace, just a piece of string with lots of precious pearls strung on this piece of string. And you ask yourself the question, which are the pearls and which is the piece of string? Are the pearls the lifetimes in the bardo or heaven and the string is merely incarnation? Or are the pearls the incarnations and the string is the bardo states in between? And I have an answer for that myself. Hinduism teaches us that the soul has two aspects. There's the Atman and Jiva. Atman is that part of the soul that never, ever, ever incarnates. And Jiva is that aspect of the soul that does incarnate and then comes back again. So it's like when you sleep at night, you don't devote all of your energy to your astral travel. There's a whole bunch of energy which is still allowing your body to breathe and your heart to beat. And the same thing is true in the heavenly realms, that there is an aspect of soul which never leaves the sight of God. And then there's an aspect of soul that incarnates. And so there are times when we're not incarnated. But there are never times when we're not at source. And so the lifetime really is our life with God at source, or heaven, or bardo, whatever you want to call it. And the incarnation are just little interludes on that lifetime. So for me, when we talk about life between lives, life for me is our heavenly existence, and the life between lives are our incarnations, not the other way around. So that's the first point I want to make this morning. So the second point I want to make then is developing your own roadmap of reality. We did a whole retreat about this either last year or the year before, where we talked about developing your own personal cosmology. And a cosmology must be much greater than, your political viewpoint, or your cultural accretion, or even your religious affiliation. It has to be much, much bigger than this. It's about you becoming an Israel. The word Israel was a nickname that God gave to Jacob after Jacob had wrestled all night with God. So in fact, the word Israel literally means the man who wrestled with God. Is man Ra El, who wrestled with God. God is El. So Israel was a title that God gave to Jacob after he had wrestled all night long with him. And that's really what a roadmap of reality is about. It's about us having the courage to wrestle with God, to try to make sense, of an entire purpose here. And so this wrestling with God, I suggested in the past, revolves around 4 kinds of questions. The question of, who do I believe God is? Who do I believe I am? Who do I believe my neighbor is? And what do I believe my mission to be? But for the purposes of the homily today, I just want to focus on the mission piece. How do we identify what our mission is? So is our purpose in life simply to become parents so we can kind of usher in the next generation into incarnation? And if that's true, then is the only purpose in life is to become a mother or a father so you can have children who can have children, who can have children, who can have children, so that a whole line of souls get to experience incarnation. That's very powerful. It's a beautiful part of the mission to become a parent and to afford somebody else or other souls the opportunity to incarnate. You're offering them a spacesuit into which they can experience incarnation. That is a beautiful gift. But there's much, much more to the soul's mission than merely becoming a parent. There's the whole idea of not just ushering people into incarnation, but ushering them into enlightenment. So a much more important part of the mission is greater than just becoming a parent and ushering souls into incarnation. It is then ushering those souls into enlightenment, of being the kind of person, the kind of parent, and the kind of teacher who helps the kids to develop enlightenment, to become loving beings. And so how long does this process take? It's depending on what kind of incarnation you're experiencing. So, for instance, I'm looking outside here. I've got oak trees, scrub oaks and real oaks and all kinds of trees here. An acorn, when an acorn drops from the mother tree, it takes 50 years before that acorn can become an oak tree that drops acorns of its own. So you plant an acorn, it'll develop a sprout very quickly, it'll grow, but it'll be 50 years old before it's capable of dropping an acorn of its own. So the life cycle for an oak tree then to become a parent is about 50 years. You take human beings and we manage to do that in about 12 years. Physiologically, a newborn infant is only going to take about 12 years before it's physiologically capable of becoming a parent itself. So we've shrunken it from 50 years right down to 12. But if you take your kitty cat, it only takes a newborn kitten 6 months to go from being a newborn to being the mother of a little kitty. 6 months, really shrunk it down. Or you take a fruit fly only takes 2 days from the time it's birthed until it gives birth. So the whole thing telescopes. So time in some senses is made up. And so how long do you want to take to become enlightened? How long did it take you to become a parent? And how long will it take you before you not just usher the next generation of souls into incarnation, but you can usher the next group of souls into enlightenment? That's really the deepest purpose of your being here. And this was the core message of Jesus. His last testament the night before he died was, the same things I do, you will do, and even greater, because I go back to the Father and I send you the Spirit. So this really is the high point of our missions, not just to become parents, giving spacesuits to souls in order to experience incarnation, but giving example and teaching to these souls in order to usher them into enlightenment. And Jesus showed that there were 2 basic ways of doing that. It is by preaching good news and by healing sickness. That's really where we're here. In essence, the mission of every single one of us is to preach good news and to heal sickness. Not so much by getting up in a butter box and making speeches, but by our essence, by who we are, by how we relate to each other in interpersonal relationships, how we relate as communities to each other, and how we relate as a species to Gaia, to Mother Nature herself. So is enlightenment then about perfection? And what does perfection mean? Enlightenment is about perfection, but not in the way in which we've been taught, in the Christian churches. Perfection is not the achievement of a stainless steel sinlessness. That is not perfection. Perfection is the radical commitment to the mission for which you incarnated. The radical commitment to the mission for which you incarnated. That is perfection. And that involves lots of missteps and detours and distractions. All of us are going to get lost at various stages and make mistakes at various stages. That's not what perfection is about. Perfection is about that every time we take a detour, or every time we make a misstep, or every time we get distracted from the purpose, we come back to the purpose. We come back again to what we're really here about. So we step ourselves through 3 stages: problem, solution, dissolution. That every problem we experience, begs some kind of a divine solution, in the sense that we elevate our game. But every solution we have to a human issue, whether it's on an interpersonal level, or an intercommunity level, or on a global level, every solution to a previous problem has within it the seeds of its own dissolution. So every solution will have a dissolution. Because if we don't do that, we simply stagnate. Evolution ceases. So inevitably, whatever solutions we come up with for our personal issues or for global issues, eventually those solutions won't work anymore, because Spirit is constantly inviting us into a higher level of being. And that's what evolution and enlightenment is about: the ability to constantly seek greater and greater responses to the experiences we're having. Which brings me to my 3rd point: a practical exercise. And we've done that on retreat a few years ago, but I'm going to run it by everybody this morning again. I'm going to invite you at some stage during the week, if you can take an hour or 2 off, to grab a paper and a pen and do the following exercise. I invite you to divide your life up into 7-year chunks: 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, 21 to 28, right throughout your entire lifespan. Divide it up into these 7-year chunks. And then for each section, each chunk, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1, who are the important people in my life during that period? Secondly, what were the important events in my life during that period? And thirdly, what were the important lessons I learned during that period? And sometimes the lessons will only be understood retroactively. It may be 15, 20 years after the period when you suddenly realize what the great lesson of that period was. So divide it up into 7-year chunks. And for each piece, write down who the important players were, what the important events were, and what the important lessons were. And then when you look at it, you'll begin to discover that often the important players change from time to time. When you were 0 to 7, it was probably your parents and your siblings and maybe grandparents. When you were in your late teens and 20s, it was your college roommates, perhaps. Later on, it was the neighbors, wherever you moved to live. So they'll change. The events may change. The events of the first, from 7 to 14, may be very, very different from the events from 35 to 42. But what you'll begin to see very, very often is that the lessons don't change. That the same lesson, the same 2 or 3 lessons get repeated from chunk to chunk throughout your life. You can see the very same theme running through your life, because every single one of us came down to learn 2 or 3 lessons in a particular incarnation. And although there'll be different events causing them and different relationships and persons causing them, we'll see that the same lesson keeps presenting itself again and again and again until we finally accept it and we grow through it and we evolve. And so for every one of us then the question becomes, when I look back at those lessons and when I realize that my mission in life, as well as perhaps being a parent and ushering in the next generation of incarnations, it was to preach good news and to be a healing presence. To ask myself the ultimate question, is that who I am in my life at this stage? Am I somebody who preaches good news? And I'm not talking about giving speeches. I'm talking about ordinary interpersonal dialogues. Am I preaching good news to the people who are listening to me or in dialogue with me? And am I a healing presence? Do people feel less anxious and more centered, more loving and less judgmental when they've had an encounter with me? That every single one of us can ask ourselves those questions. And that really is how I think we create a roadmap of ultimate reality, because eventually personal reality and consensual reality have to morph and become divine reality. We have to see things as God sees them.